All right, so again, the focus of my entire presentation and what really got me totally into Candombe was this idea that these three drums defined identity in Montevideo, Uruguay, and really Uruguayan national identity. This is like a highlight of that now. They quite often talk, even in politics, about Candombe as a vehicle for promoting cultural heritage, things like that. But when I started studying this in 2009, or trying to find information, everything I could find was in Spanish. I didn't speak very much Spanish. I could function at the local supermarket. But that was really about it. So I started looking for information, working my butt off to learn how to speak Spanish. And if you know anything about Rio Platense Spanish, that area of the world is quite different from the Spanish they speak in Cuba or Mexico, places like that. And I let my Spanish teacher from high school know that that verb tense that they tell you to ignore in your high school Spanish classes, I really needed in Uruguay. So there were all these new words that I'd never seen in my life. This book was kind of the book that I keyed in on, and the only author at the time, Luis Ferreira, who had identified rhythms, actually transcribed some things, and talked about how they related to neighborhood identity in Montevideo, Uruguay's capital. So when I arrived in Uruguay in 2011, one of the first things I did in my meetings with the different teachers and drummers that I was working with was I pulled out these transcriptions and just wanted to check them, see if this was accurate in any way, because through listening to things, I had started coming up with certain questions. So I meet up with, 100% of the drummers I met with, I would go in, always start with this first pattern, cuarén. And I would just play it a few times, exactly as it was notated. Usually I would finish playing, most of them would say, muy bien, muchacho. That's it, cuarén, good. So I'm like, all right, good, I'm on my way here. I'd move to charrúa. No, that's cuarén. All right, well, he says Ferreira's telling us charrúa. He's like, well, I don't know why. That's clearly the cuarén rhythm. So I made my note, moved on to cerro. No, that's cuarén again. What are you doing? And none of these musicians read music, so, it was me just trying to interpret this based on what I was seeing and playing for them. Those top three were always cuarén. So I made my notes, moved on to the encina pattern. Good, muy bien. That's encina. All right, it's a little slow. That was generally what would be said. Okay, perfect. Here's cerrito. No, that's encina. Okay, you see the pattern that's happening. So I would always end with gaboto. Now encina again. Okay. The pattern emerged, and as I set out and studied more in Montevideo, what I realized fairly quickly is that anytime you isolated a single rhythm, you were either going to be told that it was cuarén or encina, based on what happened during the third beat. So when you talk about rhythmic identity, and these Toques Madres, if you talk about rhythmic identity in Candombe, rhythm alone will usually only refer to one of those top two styles. When you expand beyond that rhythm, you end up with more styles. Something to note here is that each of these styles on the board, on the screen, refer to places in Montevideo. So cuarén, encina, and gaboto are streets in the central area of Montevideo. Cuarén is in a neighborhood called Barrio Sur, which is where the enslaved Africans sort of first made their homes. So it was it's sort of known as the traditional area. It's the smallest. Then they expanded out to areas in Palermo, which is right next to Barrio Sur, and Encina is a street located in Palermo. Those two were actually rival, so those groups were generally rivals. Just north of Palermo, still in that central Montevideo area, is the street Gaboto. And what was taking place on all of these streets is in the sort of mid-1850s, mid-1800s, that's what I'm looking for, through the early 1900s, there was a wave of European immigration that was moving into these areas, and the European immigrants couldn't afford to move into the sort of wealthier areas of Montevideo. They were taking up residence in these areas that had historically been African-derived or Afro-Uruguayan at that point, and they started sharing in the sort of community aspects. The great way I've heard it is one way to become Uruguayan was to take part in an Afro-Uruguayan art form. So that was kind of happening. What happened later, and why you start getting all of these other style designations that are really difficult to define, is in the 1970s and 80s, there was a dictatorship. A military dictatorship was in Uruguay. It was very violent. And one of the things that happened is they destroyed those areas and dispersed the residents throughout the city. So people playing the Cuarem style ended up in other places, like the Cerro, one of those rhythms that was related to that style. Or Gaboto residents ended up in Cerrito. And it expands even further out into departments outside of the capital city. What the dictatorship thought would happen was that Candombe would be erased. And it actually had the opposite effect. It exploded. So in the 1960s and 70s, you might have 12 groups taking part in Carnival. When I saw Carnival in 2012, there were 44 groups taking part. And those were the groups that qualified, because there's also now a qualifying parade to even be a part of that event. So again, what ends up happening now is everyone takes the Cuarem or Encina rhythm and they do their own thing with it. And there's some other factors, and these are on the sheets, we'll talk about them, that you can get into, but to sort of focus in on each group, Cuarem, again, is defined by a third beat. You can play a rhythm and say, this is Cuarem. And these are just 4 examples. It tends to be the least varied of the two styles. The 2 lower rhythms are actually older patterns related more to, I think, some of the tango type sounds you might hear. But you play it. Style, it doesn't tend to speed up much more than that, although I'm going to tell you that, and this ensemble's playing it really, really fast. I wanted to kind of feel some other defining factors of the Cuarem style. I kind of set a slower tempo. It generally characterizes that. The Chicos are generally double the number of pianos in that ensemble, and they tend to play that repicado pattern, so the one that filled in every beat. And then repiques are very measured, so they play a lot of madera and then jump in with just minor sort of soloistic lines as opposed to like long running lines of fills. This particular group is one, I chose. There aren't a lot of groups playing Cuarem anymore. Really, there were 2 that I could clearly define as being a Cuarem-based ensemble when I was living there. And this was one of them. And part of that is also a family tradition that's maintained in this group. They can trace, the members of this ensemble can trace their roots all the way back to some of the original inhabitants of the Cuarem tenements, where Candombe they say was born. And this is just a little bit of the Cuarem style. drum group won. And when I was asking, trying to get some reactions about how people felt about Quarem Dieciochento winning Carnival, a lot of them said it was fine, but it wasn't Quarem. And the immediate answers were that the rhythm was too fast. They were playing a lot of piano repicados, which is a sort of rhythm coming off of that basic standard rhythm. So they were filling in a lot more, and a lot of sort of really traditional players outside of that style were saying, it's not Quarem though. When I started asking the leaders of this group, and especially Waldemar Cachila Silva, I mean, he used a curse word basically and said, it's crazy, my family has always lived here, we're playing that rhythm, but we need to win this money to maintain a lot of what we're doing. And he's like, nobody's gonna care if we play this rhythm too slow in Carnival anymore. So they're still playing the Chigo Repicado pattern, they're playing a lot of these musical things, but even just speeding it up to a point to where it sounds like maybe an Encina or a Gaboto type ensemble speed, there are people that kind of attack some of that and say, it's no longer, they're sort of destroying the tradition. Now, if you see this group outside of Carnival, you might see really slow traditional performances, but in this context, because money kind of drives everything, and so that they can maintain even having the ensemble, they make compromises. So Encina tends to be the most varied. What's important to note is you will never hear an Encina ensemble. This is how you can kind of define this. An Encina ensemble will never play that dotted 8th, 16th rhythm on beat 3. It will always fill in. It's usually a little bit more dense, but never that Quarem sound. I include number 1 because it sort of fills in the full sort of 4/16 notes, and everything after that tends to be varied on the first 3 notes in the Encina style, except for number 2. Rhythms that I played were actually the really old styles, and number 4 would have been a traditional piano bass pattern, and number 5 would have been a bombo, the much larger drum at the time. And what you kind of see, a really standard Encina pattern that you'll hear is usually number 3. That tends to be the most common, and you'll hear that in the video that I'll play. But if you look at those 2 patterns, number 4 and 5, you can actually see the sort of synthesis of those 2 drums coming together, taking that 3E and the and that would have sounded on the bombo and becoming number 3. One. Does that make sense? Yeah? Perfect. Encina, some other things that define it, it's a lot more balanced in terms of an ensemble. What you'll really hear when you move past Quarem are the calls on the piano. Now, repiques are much more active. And again, the calls on the piano are when you hear a lot more players playing lines like. So that tends to be, there'll be members of the ensemble playing a piano, sort of placed in different spots around the group, and so you'll hear them calling to one another and someone else will answer, or maybe a repique will answer and then pianos will respond to that sound. This group is kind of interesting here because they represent that dispersion that happened during the dictatorship. The leader of this ensemble was a resident of the Encina conventillos, or the Encina tenement housing. They actually live in an area now that's about 30 to 45 minutes outside of the city center. But this group is still considered because it can trace its family heritage and all of that to that original sort of Encina style. But most of the members of the ensemble never actually lived there, took part in that. But it's still one of the few groups that clearly defines this style. It's also a very technically skilled ensemble. This is one of the groups I picked simply because you can clearly hear that Encina rhythm being played without a lot of variation at this point. Videos like this is actually, you get to see the oral tradition also actually still like taking place. Those kids in the front playing, and you see like 3 to 5 year old kids sometimes just playing lines that the really old or PK players are playing, and it's really amazing to see. And there was also a kid doing like twirling a baton kind of thing, and he's following one of the other characters called the Escobero of the parade. And I mean, he's dropping things and all, but you can see he's got the routine down. And there's no real school to learn this there except to just walk out to the streets, get a drum, and start playing. So moving on to Gaboto, which is the style that I just use as reference points for expansion of the rhythms. It's really cool because this is still living history in a lot of ways. The guy on the screen here, Aquiles Pintos, is one of 2 brothers who are thought to have created this style of music, or this style of playing. And what he says is that the groups from Encina would come up towards their area in the Gaboto Street, and groups from Corén would also come into that area. And they would usually meet and have, basically a drum battle in those areas. And so these 2 guys, these brothers, would be watching, but what they were taking away was both styles of playing. Encina was more exciting, so it was faster. So what happened with Gaboto was really that Corén rhythm got sped up. Before I kind of play what might sound more traditionally Gaboto, though, I just thought it was really cool. There was the day in September, shortly after I arrived, Aquiles had not played, apparently, in quite a long time when I got there, and he just decided last minute to demonstrate for this group of people how to play piano in the Gaboto style. And he's, 93 years old now. And it's slow. It's slower than any Gaboto pattern would ever be, but you can see the weight that he puts behind it still at his age. The 2 guys sitting beside him in that video are actually his sons, so it's another sort of element that you can see. Gaboto is still very much a family tradition, whereas once you move outside of Corén and Sina Gaboto, you'll hear people talk about different styles, but they tend to be really new, and there's no sort of anchor as to where they emerged from at this point. And again, it relates more, styles outside of those 3 now relate more to what happened during that dictatorship when everyone got spread out and just started interacting with one another a little bit more. Gaboto tends to be the wildest style. I mean, they play with reckless abandon in all seriousness. It's the style that I struggled the most with when I would hear it in the streets. And it's kind of like Corén. There are only 2 groups that you can say are really Gaboto oriented at this point. The piano is much heavier, and as you saw from the video, they can play either rhythm. So Corén, they can play that, they can play Encina, put them together. There's a lot of, if Encina has a lot of those calls, Gaboto takes it to another level. Sometimes the rhythm won't even come out. And I'll just try to play a little bit of the Encina style like piano. And that would be Encina-esque. what's also problematic and what Luis Ferreira struggled with when he was taking down those patterns and transcribing them is, if you have a large gabboto ensemble, like the one you're going to hear here, if you transcribe the collective rhythm, the rhythm that's happening by all players, especially on the piano, the result on the page is going to look like the encina pattern. So someone like me, who comes in to play that, not knowing that you can vary that style up or anything, I was playing an encina pattern initially every time. What changes in gabboto is on that third beat, there's a lot more sort of variation in the sort of dynamic quality. You might have one player playing the quatrain pattern. At the same time, you might have two guys playing two different encina patterns. So when you get to the third beat, there's a little bit more sort of up and down in that. It's hard to hear, and I found that once you're outside of the encina quatrain patterns, I would take people to see these parades all the time, especially the ones where there would be 30 to 70 groups marching past, taking up your whole day. A lot of people were bored after 20 groups because your ears just can no longer sort of process some of the differences that are taking place. And you can see, if you can hear some of that, with this group that very much defines the gabboto style.